evening, good evening, good evening. Tonight we're gonna. Oh, it's a bit creaky. Oh God, sorry about that. Oh, hang on. Let me just. It's creaky. I'm not quite sure. Oh, yeah, let's just sort that out. Right, that's a bit. It's definitely creaky, isn't it? You can hear that. I'll try not to touch the microphone. Right, so tonight, welcome. This is the third session of this course, the Earth as a Freudian Spaceship. And just to remind you, this is a kind of seminar course, not a teaching course so much. This is a course that develops out of a book that I'm working on with Dr. Eric Harper. And it's more like the report of a research project. The first part of a 3-part book has been distributed so some participants as part of the course. This is the part called Breath, and what we're talking about in this course are second and third sections of the book, the body and earth. And so that's kind of the role of the course. What that basically means is there's 3 sessions, last week's on Fanon, this week on Freud, next week on Deleuze and Guattari, that kind of set up the conversation, give some of the background and framing of the project, and after which hopefully we can explore some of the issues in a bit more of a conversational way. That basically means that it will kind of be there's a bit more openness as to where participants want to go. So if you've got an interesting thing that you want to discuss or talk about that's kind of related to this project, involved in this project, that kind of connects to the project, then that's the purpose of the sort of second part of the course, to engage in that kind of conversation. Okay, so that's just the outline of that. If you're on the Free University of Brighton, there will be a seminar at 8 o'clock on River. If you're not in the Free University of Brighton, there is a Discord that I've put some of the reading up on, details of which you can find on the Twitch page. Okay. I think that's all the housekeeping, as we call it, that we need. Right, so where are we? We're today looking at Freud. So last week we looked at Fanon. And one of the ways I discussed it last week is in terms of Fanon, Freud and Deleuze and Guattari being, as it were, the teachers from which the project that I'm working on with Eric, they're the teachers from which the project kind of draws. So we're not doing interpretation work, we're not doing critical analysis work, we're kind of developing our own response to the world around us. But obviously we don't do that in isolation, we do that in relationship to certain kinds of teachers, and so that's the best way of understanding this. And so each of these sessions, last week on Fanon, this week on Freud, next week on Deleuze and Guattari, each of these sessions in setting up the framework of the conversation for the course essentially looks at what we can learn from these different teachers in our particular situation. So not necessarily what you can learn, but what we've learned. So in a sense, what we've got here is we're trying to talk to you, or I'm trying to talk to you about the way in which we're trying to respond to the world, and the idea being not that this is right or wrong or true or false, but that this is kind of a prompt for a conversation about how we respond to the world, that wider kind of question, in particular a world in which Black Lives Matter and climate change kind of frame our contemporary moment. So what can we learn from Freud? As I mentioned in session 2, when I talk of learning from, it's not a simple matter of grabbing an argument from some thinker, of mining some seam of cleverness. It instead involves reflecting on how the person speaks to us, what it is that calls to us from the work. And this often involves noticing how a particular phrase, a formula or a model grabs our attention. Now, close reading is an important skill in the practice of philosophy. Slow reading and close reading involve paying attention to the way the philosopher has written, even to how they might inadvertently import unthought elements into their work. It's a crucial form of philosophical interpretation, but it aims at understanding the author, and this aim is assumed to be neutral. Now, whilst close reading is valuable and important, this neutrality assumption is a booby trap. It assumes that there's some clean truth that we can access. Moreover, it assumes that this aim of understanding the author is unproblematic, that it's right. Why is this a booby trap? As we pursue the thought of a philosopher, as we try to carefully understand, it's too easy to forget the bodies involved, our bodies. It's too easy to take on the persona of the intellectual, the one who knows, or the one who pursues the truth. What's forgotten are the bodies. Why this text? Why this author? Why this particular thought? The responsive bodies, the organising bodies, the ancestral bodies, these are too easily forgotten as we slip into the comfortable neutrality of the intellect at work. Now, something here speaks to how we understand the process within which we are working when we try to understand something. And I've put up this, let's see if I can pop this up for you now. This is going to be a little bit of a test. I put up this kind of slogan that you can see there. Kind of articulates a little bit of what I'm saying at the moment. Beware the understanding. So something here speaks to how we understand the process within which we are working when we try to understand something. These processes of understanding, of learning, are caught up in the institutions within which they are carried out, the university and the school, for example. They are also caught up in the processes that prompt the desire to learn. Now, this desire to learn, what if it's a desire to quieten some trouble? If everything is easy, everything works, nothing troubles us, then what would prompt us to learn? Put aside the purely functional, the I need to get X qualification to get Y job, and consider instead the desire to learn as a response to the problems of living. Something doesn't work, doesn't feel right, seems hidden or obscure, and we want to know, or more, we want to quieten the disquiet we feel. Our bodies need a way of dealing with the disquiet, of settling the tension, of restoring calm. One way is to learn, to have a moment of insight or clarity, a moment of understanding. This settles us for the night, tucks us in, gives us a sense of empowerment. At least I know why it's happening, at least I know what is happening. Aha, yes, of course, that makes perfect sense. We understand, and we no longer need to learn. We have settled things. We have quietened the chatter in our heads and simplified the tensions. And the point here is not to denigrate understanding or to deny the effectiveness of learning, rather it's to point to an element of the process that is forgotten, which is that it's hard to learn if it involves an increase in discomfort, if it makes us feel less secure, less certain, less sure of ourselves. And all learning involves a degree of discomfort, because it must involve a movement from not knowing to knowing, or perhaps from feeling like we don't know to feeling like we do know. To learn is to encounter the fact that we didn't know. And this is perhaps fine in the abstract, but it might be a little less comfortable if what we are learning about implicates our ignorance. If we learn, for example, that a way of speaking or acting was harmful. We see this problem playing out at the moment in the discussions around racism. Such discussions aren't neutral. They involve us, they implicate us, they touch us. So we find that concepts such as white fragility arise as ways of trying to articulate this implicated relationship the participants have in the conversation about race. Now, when Fanon speaks of the epidermalization of a structure, he is pointing to this implication of the body, to its involvement. The skin is a point of contact with structure or system or process. Just to remind ourselves, this is Fanon from the Introduction to Black Skins, White Masks, which we spoke about last session. The analysis we are undertaking is psychological. It remains nevertheless evident that for us, the true disalienation of the black man implies a brutal awareness of the social and economic realities. The inferiority complex can be ascribed to a double process. First, economic, then internalization, or rather epidermalization of this inferiority. Now, two things call to me in this passage. Two things speak to me, prompt me to want to learn. The first, perhaps, is the word epidermalization. It crystallizes something. It sits there, waiting to be heard, to talk some more. The second came later, and it's the word brutal. The true disalienation of the black man implies a brutal awareness of the social and economic realities. A brutal truth, a brutal awareness. Not easy, not comfortable, not an easy truth, but a brutal truth. Now, something here calls us to notice the bodies involved, the experiences involved, the difficulty involved. Avoiding that awareness seems, in this context, quite understandable. Why put yourself through such a process? For Fanon, it seems the claim is that only the brutal can be a path to true disalienation. It's important, I think, not to hear this as some sort of humble brag. It's not because it's somehow a higher form of awareness. Look at me, how strong I am. Rather, it's because it's only through the body, only in going through the body, that the black man, to use Fanon's phrase, can encounter this process of racism, the social and economic realities. And it's here that Freud comes in. Arrogantly puffing on the cigars that were to destroy him, he engages precisely in such an attempt at brutal awareness. His breakthrough work, The Interpretation of Dreams, is a form of self-analysis. His dreams, his desires, his self is what fascinates him, something that is made obvious in the letters he writes to Wilhelm Fleiss as he writes the interpretation, the Traumdeutung, the dream book. Freud brings the body to bear on the self, and in doing so produces a huge machinery of concepts, a huge cacophony of ideas that constantly seem to squirm and shift, all in the service of the attempt at brutal awareness. Now, just as an aside here, there's a really interesting book by someone called Alexander Welsh. So what Welsh says is perhaps what Freud is doing is something in the service of an attempt to present as though he's engaged in an act of brutal awareness. This form of presentation, like something like only I can face up to the truth of human desire and sexuality, might well produce both insights and obfuscations. Okay, and in Welsh's book, it's a fascinating reading of Freud's interpretation called Freud's Wishful Dream Book. Welsh carefully and slowly reads the interpretation as embodying Freud's ambition in a wish to know. And Welsh analyses and tracks the body in the text via its pleasures. And a theory, Welsh suggests, sometimes takes refuge in knowingness, and akin to the knowingness as a source of so much pleasure in the dream book. A page later, he says that on page 131 of the text, and a page later he remarks, after noting the sweeping nature of Freud's claims, he notes specifically that the claim that every dream is a fulfillment of a wish is a kind of exhilarating claim, and he says that it's exhilarating to make sweeping claims, and the immediate payoff may be credit for a universal theory of dreams, the discovery of a scientific law. Now, what Welsh notices is how these ideas are not neutral, not clean. They are instead what I referred to in the first session as dirty thoughts, implicated in the body and its desires, and its pleasures and its dynamics. And so even Freud, whilst engaging in this brutal awareness, is expressing in his text these kind of pleasures, these kind of activities of the body. Now, reading Freud is, I think, exasperating. He makes things slide, squirm, shift as he brings the body to bear on consciousness. Now, crucially, a word I noticed that I use a lot last session, like a little tick. When I was reviewing the session, I noticed this word crucially kept coming up. But again, crucially, what Freud does is he multiplies the self. No longer is there a singularity here, no longer a simple point. But now we have these multiple moments, each struggling with each other. So a quick review of some basic Freudian concepts. Just a naming here, just a naming. So the id, the ego, the superego, manifest and latent content, repression, both primary and secondary process, cathexis, abreaction, transference, sublimation, displacement and condensation. There's this whole panoply of terms and concepts in Freud, one that is so widespread as to produce a whole system, a language of psychoanalysis. Now, one of the most interesting texts about Freud is in fact called just that, The Language of Psychoanalysis. It's written in the 1970s by Jean Laplanche and Jean-Bertrand Pontalis, and it presents at first sight as a kind of dictionary. It has entries for all the basic concepts from Freud, each entry naming a concept and giving a little account of it. And as you begin to read the book, you realise that there are these little asterisk marks, these little stars after some words, each star indicating another Freudian concept, another entry in the text. And it's as though it's a hyperlinked text. And you can begin anywhere and track these threads of connection between one concept and another. And it's a beautiful book, one to get lost in, but one that makes it even clearer that with Freud, you either buy into it or you don't. There's no royal road to Freudianism, rather there's this curious machinery of concepts that appears to call to some and repel others. I don't buy it personally, not fully. Not to the extent that I could live in the Freudian space, but at the same time there's this compelling sense of a new kind of narrative of the self, a new kind of way of encountering the human, the body, the mind. Now, as I said, the primary component of this new narrative is the multiplication of the self. How Freud organises the self as a complex interplay between different forces and drives, rooted in the body and expressed in consciousness. Now, as part of this interplay of forces, we encounter the difficulty of a neutral knowledge, but also, crucially, the engagement with an insight. In the last session, one of the things I was pointing to at the end was those conceptual systems, such as those of Fanon or Marx, which present us with structures that constitute oppressions, the colonised, the racialised, the proletarianised, for example. Structures which, to the extent that they explain the oppression, produce an impersonal imposition. Now, at the same time, and this is far clearer in many ways in Fanon, the affirmation of life in the face of such impersonal systems is just as much a part of the conceptual system. Now, my interest in this situation was in how we might think of these moments of the affirmation of life, and how we might nurture, cultivate and sustain such moments. And here the question becomes less one of understanding and moves to the question of survival. How can we survive? How can we sustain the moments of breakthrough that we encounter in the affirmation of life to produce a breakdown in the systems that alienate? The lessons of psychoanalysis are perhaps to be found less in the squirming systems from Freud to Klein or Lacan than in these engaged attempts to form breakthroughs, to sustain breakthroughs. But bluntly, what makes psychoanalysis interesting is its purpose, which is not one of knowing, but one of changing a constituted reality. Psychoanalysis would be worthless as a theory without psychoanalysis as a practice. And this will apply to both the revolutionary and the sorcerer as well, which is one of the reasons that these three conceptual persona form part of the way we have been responding to the world. Part of the reason these conceptual persona that I mentioned in session 1 are part of our project. Now, what's curious about psychoanalysis is that the practice would equally be worthless without the theory. And yet there's no causal relationship here. There's not a mechanical movement from the theory to action. It's not like learning an engineering problem. Where we, crudely speaking, might say something like the following: have a goal, conceive a solution, work out the strengths and weaknesses of a material with which you can build the solution, and then test. The more accurate my theory of, say, the properties of physical material and forces, the more accurate my initial building of a solution in an engineering situation. There is a test and refine loop, such that the practice can inform the theory, but fundamentally the theory is the ground of the practice. In psychoanalysis, the relation is more like a marriage, a codependency, a co-constitution. The theory might be complete bullshit in reality, but like a good story, does it engage the audience? Does it enable the imagination to move? Does it produce shifts in the bodies engaged? Engineering or physics might require accuracy of the representation of the world, whereas psychoanalysis requires a workable relation. And in terms of our response to the world, the workable relation is more urgent than ever. Okay, I'm going to take a pause for 5 minutes there because someone mentioned last week that things were quite complicated, so I'm just going to take a pause for 5 minutes. So I'll put a little bit of, well, I would put some music on, but they keep cutting things out if I do that. But I'm going to take a pause for 5 minutes. So just go and have a breather, have a little browse around, do whatever you need to do, and I'll return in 5 minutes. Okay, hopefully you had a little bit of a chance to have a look at that, and I'll read it out in a moment anyway, that little quote from Freud that was up there. So, shall we return? And this is, so let's have a closer look at this point. Let's look a little bit more closely at some of what Freud actually says. And I'm looking at the text, An Outline of Psychoanalysis. So this has been placed on River and it's on Discord, and I asked people to just have a look at the first few chapters of that. Now, this is something Freud writes in 1938, something he leaves unfinished, which is published in 1940, just after his death. So it's not quite his last text, but it's close to it. It presents, when you read it, when you kind of get a sense of what's going on in it, or when you're just, I suppose, reading the atmosphere of it, it presents as a kind of codification of psychoanalysis. It's not a case history, nor is it one of the more fluid, slippery texts that Freud produces throughout his life, where there's a to and fro, a discussion of his ideas in which counter-arguments and difficulties are staged. Rather, this is a very plain text, direct, straightforward, with the tone of the scientific biology from which Freud's work arose and to which he always appeared to aspire. And it's as though we are reading a textbook, a teaching aid, or a creed. Maybe given the moment it's produced just as he's dying from a horrendous cancer of the mouth brought on by the continual sucking on the cigars, he feels a need to stamp his mark, his standard on the growing field of psychoanalysis, the last word on the matter, something like that. So here's the opening of chapter 2 of the book An Outline of Psychoanalysis, which is the text that you've got God, there. You can see it next to me anyway. That's the text we've got there, and that's the bit that was up in full screen just before. So I'll just read through. This is the opening of chapter 2 of An Outline of Psychoanalysis. The power of the id expresses the true purpose of the individual organism's life. This consists in the satisfaction of its innate needs. No such purpose as that of keeping itself alive or of protecting itself from dangers by means of anxiety can be attributed to the id. That is the business of the ego, which is also concerned with discovering the most favourable and least perilous method of obtaining satisfaction, taking the external world into account. The superego may bring fresh needs to the fore, but its chief function remains the limitation of satisfactions. The forces which we assume to exist behind the tensions caused by the needs of the id are called instincts. They represent the somatic demands upon mental life. Though they are the ultimate cause of all activity, they are by nature conservative. The state, whatever it may be, which a living thing has reached, gives rise to a tendency to re-establish that state so soon as it has been abandoned. Okay, so that's page 5, it's Outline of Psychoanalysis, chapter 2. So even in this short description of the psychic apparatus, we can see these multiple forces, this multiplied self. The 4 factors at play, id, ego, superego, external world. We can see the so-called principle of constancy that produces this natural conservatism of the id. We can see the relationship of control or struggle for dominance between the various elements of the psyche that ensues, and at the heart of it, these instincts. Now, it's that word instincts is a real problem. In this particular text, it translates the word Treiber, the German word Treiber, which is more commonly now translated as drive. And there was a long kind of transition in the translation of Freud. And so even in the little text that I've got, the outline of psychoanalysis that I've got, that's from, it's a text from 1949, the book's from 1949. At the start of that, there's a little sort of brief note as the word instinct comes up, and in that text I mentioned earlier, the Laplanche and Pontalis text, the language of psychoanalysis, they have an entry for instinct brackets or drive. It's on page 214 if you're interested in that. And they have an entry on that which kind of points again to this way in which actually what we generally hear in instinct actually is more realistically better translated as drive. And that sort of shift The reason for that distinction between instincts and drives is instincts are essentially these kind of things outside of the mind. They're just, they're the kind of innate elements of animal behavior, whereas drive involves this psychic element, this mental element. And it involves this kind of relationship between the somatic and the psychic. So they're not quite the same as instincts, although they are. And in fact, sometimes even drive isn't quite right. Sometimes the translation might be something like urge. So the id is the kind of source of this drive, these urges. Now again, using this idea of thinking about what speaks to you in a passage, what speaks to someone in terms of, when you're learning from someone, when someone's, you're a teacher of a course, or a teacher of a kind of, in our project, a teacher of like the way in which we're framing our project. One of the lines that speaks in this passage is this speaking of the instincts. The line, they represent the somatic demands upon mental life. Somatic means bodily. Soma, the body. It's the bodily demands upon mental life. Now this, coming after those opening lines, that opening move in which the true purpose, really general phrase, isn't it? So that very opening move, the true purpose of the individual organism's life is identified with the instincts of the id, and the ego is relegated to a kind of negotiator with the outside, with the external world. And that line that the instincts represent the somatic demands upon mental life, coming after that first move, is a remarkable embodying of the kind of being that we are. Think of this for a moment. The ego, that thing we might say is me, where I say I and where I am conscious of myself, is nothing more than a mediator between my true purpose and the world, the true purpose being located in the id. So immediately we let slip something like a paternal or a parental function. The ego is there to prevent my id from crashing and burning. It's not there to know or to illuminate, but to protect. The ultimate cause of all activity, the id, is like an idiot in need of protection of the conscious ego that can negotiate with the external world, protect me from myself. Now this self-protection dynamic is central to Freudianism. And one of the things that's at the root both of the interesting narratives of behaviours that it produces, as well as its inherent conservatism, and I would say its expulsion of joy. You can almost see the whole relationship of a sensible adult protecting the wild child, crushing the child within under the boots of mediocre normality, urging conformity, stability, caution, conformity, compliance, protection. These are the watchwords of the Freudian machinery, the watchwords of the Viennese bourgeois. And this is the very model of domestication. Now it becomes even clearer in a sense, this model of domestication, if we look a couple of pages earlier in the text. And at the end of the first chapter, we find the distinction between the ego and the superego. The ego deals with the external world via the development of experience in memory, and to quote Freud, through avoiding excessive stimuli through flight, by dealing with moderate stimuli through adaptation, and finally by learning to bring about appropriate modifications in the external world to its own advantage through activity. As regards, this is Freud still, as regards internal events in relation to the id, it performs that task by gaining control over the demands of the instincts. Now this basic relation of domestication is then complicated, according to Freud, because of the long childhood of the human, which leaves a kind of imprint or trace of the parent's own mode of domesticating the child. The ego is then in a constant struggle to domesticate the id in a way that is compatible with its own domestication by its parents. Now this curious domestic drama, translated into a theoretical model of the psyche, seems almost transparently to reproduce the self-image of comfortable bourgeois family life. However, after this little soap opera is played out, there are two interesting moments. The first suddenly displaces the family and places us back in the social, somewhere near to where Fanon would develop his concept of sociogenesis, which I spoke about last session. This is Freud. I'll just bring a quote up again. The parent's influence naturally includes not merely the personalities of the parents themselves, and this I'm adding the emphasis here, So the parents' influence naturally includes not merely the personalities of the parents themselves, but also the racial, national and family traditions handed on through them, as well as the demands of the immediate social milieu which they represent. So a very posh way of saying class, really, isn't it? So he goes on to note that, like the id, the superego must represent the influence of the past, whereas the ego is principally determined by the individual's own experience. That is to say, this is to quote Freud, by accidental and current events. Now, the id and the superego stand, therefore, as the somatic and the social. The id is the somatic, the superego, the social. And that social is not just the domestic, it's not just the familiar at this point. As I say, it involves the racial, the national, the family traditions, and the immediate social milieu. So the ego, in Freud's model, remember id, ego, superego, the ego lives at the border of these two constitutive moments, domesticating the animal into the social. Now, interestingly, the last move of the first chapter reinforces this curious sense of the real tension between somatic and social factors. And again, here is Freud. I'll bring up the quote again. This general pattern of a psychical apparatus may be supposed to apply equally to the higher animals which resemble man mentally. A superego must be presumed present wherever, as in the case of man, there is a long period of dependence in childhood. The assumption of a distinction between ego and id cannot be avoided. Animal psychology has not yet taken in hand the interesting problem which is here presented. Now, this last move is one of those things that once again speaks to us, speaks to me and Eric. The human-animal distinction, which would seem so central to psychoanalysis in so many ways, the more so the more we emphasise language, as with Lacan perhaps, appears here to dissolve. The psychic apparatus of id, ego and even superego are not human, but are here presented as parts of any higher animal. Dolphins, whales, maybe the big cats, chimps and apes, and even dogs maybe. Minds proliferate well beyond the human here. Now, putting this interesting moment about the human-animal distinction aside just for now, something we want to come back to at various points as we go through, the other thing to note is this relationship of the id and the superego to the past. Now, it might seem obvious what's meant here: biological heredity and social tradition, for example. Biological heredity in the id, social tradition in the superego. Yet what slips by too quickly is the fixed nature of this past. It's happened. It's there. It's not changeable. It's a kind of necessity. Now, note how the ego is the current lived experience determined by accidental and current events. In the last session, I spoke about the tension between socializing nature and naturalizing society, and how along this tension we can find the problem of what in the first session I named as the personification of process. Now, Freud in this moment appears to be naturalizing society. He appears to be taking it as causal but fixed, a natural fact. And this is in many ways the archetypical structure of the social, including of capitalism, the transformation of a contingency based on human choices and decisions into a natural fact immune to agency. And so we can thus see here the importance of the specific way in which Fanon poses sociogeny, where he places it into a causal relation and at the same time posits it as contingent and subject to change. Okay, so moving towards the end of my kind of formal lecture here, and then after that I'm just going to read through section 2 of the breath text. So, that's what's going to happen now. So I'm just going to move here to a little bit of Marx and someone called Stern, just to kind of add a couple of bits into the models here. And so Marx still lingers in the background here, primarily because of this relationship to the social. As I mentioned in the last session, Marx's analysis of the social relations of labour, of how we work, is such that capitalism is described in terms of a machinery of forces, much in the same way that Freud describes a machinery of forces to explain the psyche. In Marx's case, however, the machine itself is central to the machinery of forces. There are 3 factors Marx describes in the labour process. Again, something I mentioned in the last session. The work itself, the first factor, the subject of work. So if the person is digging, the work is digging, the subject of work is the land being dug. It's a strange one. You often think of maybe as the object of work, but, so we have the work itself, the digging, let's say, the subject of work, the land that's being dug, and the instruments of labour, which in this case perhaps are the spade. And so there are these three factors in the labour process, and they're organised, Marx says, in a specific way within capitalism. And capitalism here is understood as a society of commodity production. Now, commodities are very specific things. They're not just stuff made by people. Commodity names the type of objects produced. It claims that the social relations that these objects embody are different under capitalism than in other social structures. So a table as a commodity is different from a table prior to capitalism, in which commodities are not the dominant form of production. And so the same kind of object actually becomes something different because of the social relationships it's embodying. Now, briefly, the commodity is a thing that's produced by work, but the work is not directed simply at producing something useful or that someone needs. It continues to have this element in it, what Marx calls use value, but it also has this other stranger element in it called exchange value. Things are made to be sold. Now, this rather simplified way of putting things marks a crucial shift in the dynamics of that machinery of the labour process. It reorganises social relations. In doing so, it reorganises the human who does the work, transforming work from a practice grounded in satisfying needs and desires to work structured and disciplined according to the logic of exchange value. Now, the id of capitalism, the driving force, what Freud called the ultimate cause of all activity, to use Freud's phrase in his model of in the psychic model, the id of capitalism is the fact that this new arrangement found in the commodity enables the production of value as if by magic. The new value produced, profit, arises from the transformation of work itself into a commodity. As Marx says, we'll just move you along here. The specific use value which this commodity, labour, possesses of being a source not only of value but of more value than it has itself. This is a strange thought, but this is important and something that will keep having a key part of the conversation. The specific use value which this commodity produces of being a source not only of value but of more value than it has in itself. This is the special service that the capitalist extracts from labour power. And in this transaction, he acts in accordance with the eternal laws of the exchange of commodity. Obviously, they're not external, they're specific to the system of commodity production in capitalism. Now, the capitalist, therefore, doesn't pay the worker for their work, but instead purchases labour power. And in particular, the emphasis here has to be on that word, power. Capital captures the power of work, and in doing so, transforms it from being productive of life to being productive of value, a value that's controlled by the capitalist. Now, capitalism thus marks a radical shift in the control of the power of human work, human activity. And it's this capturing of control that we encounter as the alienation of labour. Now, I bring forward this brief excursion back into Marx in order to notice two things. First, that at the heart of Marx is an account of the radical transformation of social relations. Capitalism is a specific social relation and is no more a natural fact. He goes on to try and establish a theory of history, a general account of how social relations change over time called historical materialism. And this is embodied in the phrase from the Communist Manifesto: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Maybe not. The point is here not to buy into historical materialism, only to note the contingency of the social, that it's not a natural fact, that it changes quite radically. Now, second, this emphasis on social relations and the different forms they can take also plays out in dealing with the psyche. I just want to indicate one other model of the machinery of the mind, the way in which the psyche is formed in relationship with the world, as part of a kind of way in which we might begin to think differently about this model of the psyche. And this model is a model of Daniel Stern. And I want to mention Daniel Stern's model because it's used by Felix Guattari, who I'll be looking at in the next session. Now, Stern proposes 4 different forms of the self, each of which layers upon the other. Instead of a single narrative development, as in Freud, governed by a dynamic of domestication, Stern suggests a gradual complication of what it means to have a self. And these 4 layers are as follows. Again, I'll pop them up for you. First, the sense of an emergent self, which forms from birth to age 2 months, which we might call continuity being established. Second, the sense of a core self, which forms for Stern between the ages of 2 and 6 months, which kind of presents and produces something like a subjective perspective. Third, the sense of a subjective self, which forms between 7 and 15 months, which produces something like the intersubjective. And then finally, the sense of a verbal self, developing from about 2 years onwards, language acquisition, abstraction, and narration. Now, what's interesting here about Stern's model is it gives a different way of thinking about the machinery of the mind. In each new layer, more complex relations with the social world are available, yet each layer remains and continues. Now, Stern develops this model in his book, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, and develops it further from this initial model in a revision where he adds 2 more layers. Now, the most important is not the detail of Stern's theories, which we can look at in more detail if we want to later. What's important is the way in which this model still places centrally the relation to the social, but displaces the curious domestic drama of the taming of the id. What also matters, returning to the remarks at the beginning of today's session, is the way in which this model speaks to us. The complexification and multi-layered set of dynamics that Stern suggests are things that speak to us, much more than the domestic drama of Freud. And it's models like these that we pick up and run with when me and Eric begin to think in terms of what we call one-to-one group and community relationships as modes in which we encounter and respond to the world, something I mentioned in the first session and which is part of the second and third sections of the book. Okay, so that's just the kind of general sort of notes for today. What I want to do next is just briefly before we end, I'm just going to read through section 2 of the first part of the book. This is chapter 2. This is called September 3rd, 2015, Alleyhocker Point Beach. And I'm just going to read through this. So at this point, it's kind of, sit back and just let it settle in. And then in about 15 minutes, we'll be having the seminar for the FUB people. So this is chapter 2 of part 1, Breath from the Freudian Spaceship. Breath is life, the first cry of life. The earth finds its life as a breathing matrix comprised of organic and inorganic interactions, which join and disjoin and rejoin in the form of new assemblages. Breath is the first drive. Moreover, drive does not begin with the oral drive, but with the breath, which lacks nothing, as it is the first synthesis of production, even though it is without a drive object, and is outside any representation, which is possibly why Freud missed it, as he sat sucking on his cigars, addicted to the eroticization of the breath. The human breath is made up of nitrogen and oxygen and a small amount of other gases, including carbon dioxide. The human breath is made possible by the operation of the sun and the Earth's green breathing ecology. The breathing Earth is a matrix comprised of molecules that exist alongside the history of the Earth, with the occasional encounter with extraterrestrial meteor sources. We breathe in the past as the transformative now that makes possible the new. We dance within the contraction and expansion of breath, the rhythmic repetition of molecular forces. These molecular forces are biochemical and geochemical processes that continually rearrange themselves, the most well-known procedure being photosynthesis, the ecological digestion and transfer metaphora of the atom of carbon, during which process the carbon is released back to the Earth's atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Through interaction with plant life, this carbon dioxide is then used to generate oxygen through the process of photosynthesis, in which leaves inhale water molecules and breathe in carbon dioxide. The touch of the sun's forces then convert the organic molecules into chemical compounds, into sugars that feed the tree, as well as producing a life-giving oxygen. The importance of this basic process of interaction between oxygen, carbon and plant is somewhat acknowledged by the United Nations on the 21st of March each year, when there is the International Day of Forests. For life to have evolved on Earth, an assemblage of chemicals was needed: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium. However, it's not enough to have the simple elements of life. They must also be self-organized, both diachronically and synchronically, in an ongoing metamorphosis. Life is an organism that begins by swimming in water and engaging in metamorphosis, taking in energy, excreting waste, breathing in some way, growing, reproducing, and developing ways to react to external stimuli like sugar or heat gradients. This metamorphosis is life's movement. All life moves. All life is metaphora and metamorph, transference and shape-shifting. Breath drives life, but is also driven by life. It is life's loving touch and one assemblage of the universe, the breathing earth, breathing life. The touch of the earth as a breathing organism that invites and embraces multiple breaths is not a metaphor. Breath is the touch of life, giving birth to a plurality of life forms. Yet now more than ever the earth struggles to breathe. Whilst on the 21st of March the United Nations formally celebrates life, each day capital uproots the ecology of the earth and a different story gets played out. Capital covers over forgotten stories which coexist alongside the destruction of the ecology, animal and human life. For example, the story of September the 3rd, 2015. His life, his breath, his beating heart. The earth is called to and even listened to, but too often it is given a name by an idiot who pretends they are its owner. Fanon, in the opening pages of Black Skin, White Masks, speaks of these idiots. There are too many idiots in this world. Here it is important perhaps to think of the earlier meaning of idiot. For the Greeks and Romans, the idiot is the private citizen, the one who thinks from their own position, the one who declines to participate in public life, political life. Today, this idiot is the one who thinks political life is a private affair, a matter for the individual. One of the core tensions that can be found playing out in many political scenes, whether they are centred on climate change, on Black Lives Matter or in gender struggles, is that between political analysis and individual responsibility. Analysis of collective political conditions frequently encounters difficulties in locating sites of responsibility, because such sites are commonly understood in personal, individual terms. The position of the idiot as a major character in contemporary capitalism is exemplified by this tension between political analysis that must deal with a collective object and political responsibility that seems impossible to locate other than at the feet of individuals, whether they be individual citizens or the personalities of specific politicians. Resistance to being held personally responsible produces a series of figures of speech, tropes, that act to render political analysis impotent. We can articulate these tropes in something like the following way. Anthropogenic climate change might exist, but I'm not responsible. Institutional racism is terrible, but I'm not a racist. Gendered violence is deplorable, but I'm not a misogynist. This is the trope of individual innocence, a kind of absurd category mistake that is only bettered in its absurdity by the trope of individual responsibility, where the agent takes on the burdens of the collective by focusing solely on their own behaviour. From here we get the absurdities of thinking climate change can be altered solely by personal recycling or dietary practices, or racism destroyed simply by raising individual awareness, or gender violence eliminated easily by proper etiquette. It is not that the behaviour of individuals is unimportant, but rather that when politics has come to mean little more than a way of coordinating individual, then now that politics is a game of idiots. Here we draw on Deleuze and Guattari's idea of conceptual personae, which is the idea that thought is filled with characters who speak, rather than individual authors, and the idiot is to be understood as such a character. The conceptual personae seem to have, to quote Deleuze and Guattari, a hazy existence, halfway between concept and preconceptual plane. The conceptual persona of the idiot is the one who says I, and sets up the cogito, but who also has the subjective presuppositions or lays out the plane. The idiot is being here transposed into the specific domain of a political thought. Who is the human? The starting point, our primary axiom, is that the human is never singular. Capitalist culture, which is a white Western formation, even whilst it claims and imposes its universality, operates not at the level of the individual as singular, but collectively, transforming collectives into consumer demographics, generic flows of consumption that must be plugged into productivities to constitute reproductive cycles of exchange. Like all cultures, there is no agency evoked here, only landscape, weather, flows. Capitalist culture swamps and subsumes all around it because of its capacity to universalise its own modes of exchange, its capacity, put simply, to spread the commodity form inside the body of the human. This capacity is devastating. Yet in this capacity we see the clue both to its dynamic and to a possible route to resistance. The clue lies in this need for the body. The Fanon body is never singular. It is only ever an assemblage. Life, breath, love equals territory. Assemblages operate. They have a life of their own. And because of this, they have a zone of operation, their territory. This territory is most often encountered in the idea of home. There is somewhere that the thing, the animal, the person, the plant is at home, or not. Whilst human beings claim a love of the home and destroy the other's home in the name of this claim, it is the animal who embodies a love of the home, of territory, a love that is expansive with cunning possibility. It is at the level of the assemblage and territory that we find the possibility of the love of life. Does this loving act form a doing, behaving, gesturing and holding, such as in the holding of the earth, or does it implode on itself like domestic violence and the meat farm? The animal's love is the ground of the home, territory, body, a love grounded not in terms of self, but in terms of the earth, space, place. In contrast, the capitalist operates like the landscape gardener in their estate grounds. Inside these grounds, we might feel as though movement is free, but only in the same way the meat from the organic farm once thought itself free. More fundamentally, the love that forms the landscape constitutes the grounds within which the body is formed. The animal's love is cunning. It appears in the negotiation of forces and is orientated to an alternative future. Fanon can perhaps be said to love just as an animal loves, something Guattari also seems to embrace in his poetic manifesto found in the text, in order to end the massacre of the body. To quote Guattari, "This antiquated world which stinks everywhere of dead flesh horrifies us and convinces us of the necessity of carrying the revolutionary struggle against capitalist oppression into that territory where the oppression is most deeply rooted, the living body. It is the body and all the desires it produces that we wish to liberate from foreign domination. It is on that ground that we wish to work for the liberation of society. There is no boundary between the two elements. I oppress myself inasmuch as that I is the product of a system of oppression that extends to all aspects of living. The revolutionary consciousness is a mystification if it is not situated within a revolutionary body, that is to say, within a body that produces its own liberation." Okay, I think that's enough for today. Thank you all very much for listening if you are around, and you're more than welcome to drop by the various different places we have for conversation. And thank you very much for listening, actually, if you are around. It's all great and good, and I'm most privileged to have you listening to me kind of, reporting on these thoughts in development. For people in FUB, I'll open the Zoom seminar now. I'm going to close this Twitch session, and I'll catch you in a few minutes. Thanks very much, everybody.
The gorilla studies. The gorilla studies. He doesn't rap. He studies and keeps his mouth shut. Study, children, study.